Hello and welcome back to Franklin Covey's twice weekly podcast on leadership with Scott Miller. 6 years and 450 plus episodes taped, just about that number released, where on Tuesdays and Fridays we have the enormous privilege of interviewing some of the world's most renowned creators, artists, thinkers, authors, thought leaders, entrepreneurs, C-level leaders, all that come onto our podcast to have a conversation about leadership, how to build an engaging culture where people choose to come and stay highly engaged. Of course, this company, Franklin Covey, is recognized as the world's most trusted leadership firm, founded in part by Dr. Stephen R. Covey 4 decades ago. You know him, of course, as the author of the seminal books, amongst many, the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Each week we have remarkable conversations on both video and audio, and today we have a bit of an alum. She is both a friend and a colleague of Franklin Covey. She's a 2-time author, well-known consultant, coach, facilitator, keynote speaker. Her name is Kristen Mackey, and her book today is called Frequency Matters. Be a contributor, not an employee. Joining us from her office and home today in Florida, Kristen, welcome to On Leadership.
Hi, thank you, Scott. It's an honor to be here.
We had been talking about having you on this podcast for a long time, and finally our schedules aligned. And today we're going to go deep into this concept of frequency. Not necessarily frequency of time or repetition, but your frequency as a leader, as a parent, as a spouse, as a friend, as a human. Before we get into those topics, would you rewind a couple of decades and perhaps reorient your professional and even personal journey to all those that are listening and watching around the world?
Absolutely. I started my career as a professional speaker, and I've always been really curious about the nature of reality. I was a very sensitive child, and I was very curious about what made life tick. So when I became a speaker, I would travel anywhere from 8 to 13 cities a month, 500 cities. And I noticed these patterns. I would work with a group. How I brought my energy to the space, I would see it show up in the responses, the feedback, even the evaluations. And then I noticed when I was also a leader in multiple organizations, I was a director for a healthcare system geographically dispersed, a director for a large hospitality industry, and I added these principles to the work that I did, and it allowed a sort of unified language. The Frequency Matters was a way of communicating to connect individuals and give a sort of universal language to complicated concepts.
I mean, it's not a new idea altogether, but a lot of your insights and research really help to kind of bring us as leaders back to the gravity, back to ground level of how much our presence, our energy really matters. In the book, Frequency Matters, you define it as our energy, our mojo, our vibe, our presence, our well-being, our instincts and our feelings. You know, as I was reading your book in preparation for the podcast, and I've known of you and your work for some time, also through your association with the Franklin Covey Company, I think about, had I had this language, had I understood perhaps the gravitas, Kristen, of how much our energy impacts culture and people's engagement, I think I would have been a better leader. I think I kind of knew, but I didn't know how to marshal it and manage it and direct it. Talk about why of all of the topics you wrote and researched about our frequency.
I absolutely love the concept of making something simple. And so I started to talk about particles because the more I went down the rabbit hole of quantum mechanics, I learned about particles. And so there was a program once that I was doing at the hospital, and there was a lot of negative energy. It was short staffed. They had a lot of challenges. And out of nowhere, while I was giving team building exercises, I just blurted out, everything is out there. What we focus on, how we carry our energy is what we're going to bring to the space. We're going to bring that to the hospital. We're going to bring that to the wing. So let's make it about our energy, how we carry ourselves. What are the thoughts we're putting in our mind? I see human beings as we're recipes. We have a lot of different personalities. We have different value systems. We're very diverse in so many ways. But if we can find that unifying language that also honors the person's uniqueness, that to me was something that I had a lot of passion around crystallizing in language. And that's what you're seeing with the Frequency Matters.
Kristen, you're a very seasoned, you might even call a social scientist, a researcher and consultant. And of 6 years in this podcast and almost 500 interviews taped, about 450 released, two concepts that I'm sort of deeply obsessed and interested in right now are really focused around why we are the way we are, right? Our epigenetics, if you will,
Yes.
and our origin story. Scott Miller behaves the way I do because of my epigenetics and because of my origin story. My family upbringing, my parents, my grandparents, my brother, where I was raised, my first leader, the teachers I had, and I behave as a leader, as an entrepreneur, the way I do for reasons. They're so deeply ingrained in me, and I think, like most of us, there is a disconnect, a dissonance, if you will, between the way we present ourselves and the way we think we are received, and the fact of how we are received, of how we show up in the workplace. Would you maybe peel the onion a bit and remind all of our listeners and viewers why that dissonance is so present and real and human, and what are some of the things that all of us can do to get a better sense for how we present ourselves as rarely how we are received, and what can we do to get on top of that?
Of course, when we are very conscious of our mindset and how we're carrying our body, our energy, or how we're being perceived, you'll get feedback. You'll get feedback from the folks that you're working with. You'll see individuals that either resonate, as you mentioned, or I call it in frequency matters. We want to manage resonance, or we want to manage dissonance, and we want to embody resonance. And how we carry ourselves, if someone is attracted or repelled by the energy that we carry, we have to be vulnerable, and we have to look at what am I doing or what am I saying that may be creating that sort of dissonance. And sometimes we can be really great with it and peel the onion and journal it out and do, as you probably were exposed to, Scott, shadow work and all that good stuff down the rabbit hole of epigenetics. But it also could be something as simple as a conversation we have with someone to say, how am I coming off? What is my energy? What do you feel when you're with me? What do you feel, when we do a program together or a project together? What kind of leader I am? I think sometimes the assessments can capture that to a certain degree, but too often we don't want to put pen to page on what we really think to give that person that feedback. So that is where the psychological safety is really important, and that high trust on those one-on-one conversations to find out, am I being perceived the way I think I am? And then having the courage to really look in the mirror and say, how do I pop out my dents if I have any unconscious trauma, and spring my slinkies? And I'm dating myself with the slinkies, but that it kind of pins back to that wonderful book, The Untethered Soul, where, we have energy inside of us. And if we don't manage that, if we don't pay attention to what it's doing to influence us, we may actually be just emulating a program that was imprinted on us. And I think that's the real work of the individual, but it takes a lot of vulnerability, Scott, to go down that space.
Well, it takes enormous vulnerability and maturity and self-awareness. To quote our mutual friend and mentor, Stephen Covey, says easy, does hard, right? Because if I were to sit down with someone, and I have on countless occasions, and ask them, what's it like to work with me? What's it like to be led by me? What's it like to lead me? What I typically would get 9 times out of 10, Kristen, would be anxious, intense, intimidating, unsettling, inspiring, but sometimes crippling by your intensity and your drama. And what's interesting is, it's funny, I don't see that. I know that's true, but I don't see that. What I see is a short life trying to get a lot done, trying to help a lot of people, trying to manage my excitement for a lot of things and move the metaphorical football down towards the end zone. I know that I'm received as being intense. It's one of my strengths. All of our strengths, when overplayed, they of course can become our weaknesses. It does take an unnatural level of humility and vulnerability and patience and maturity to understand how is your frequency working for or against you, and how is it working for and against other people. Maybe remind our listeners and viewers some of the techniques people can, begin to adopt to better understand how their frequency is creating or destroying culture on their team or in their organization?
Yes, I think it's important to do that inner work where you get the feedback and then you implement some of the changes. But I also have a lot of passion around an individual being unique. I think we want to avoid the kink in the hose. In other words, the Scott being Scott is your nature, and you have all these wonderful qualities that make you unique, that make you Scott, and that's your nature. And leaders that have done the work where they have owned and they love their unique energy, their unique frequency signature, you might say, they see that in others. And so, yes, somebody can have a certain kind of energy and it may rattle another person's personality. But I think if the work goes both ends, and this kind of ties back to the win-win habit of highly effective people, if we recognize that we want to be seen and loved and nourished as a human being with all our complexities in our authenticity, and we want that, then we offer that as leaders to others. And it doesn't negate excellence. It doesn't negate, doing the right work, showing up, dotting the I's, crossing the T's. I really believe that when you have really high standards for your team members, that is an act of love, because you are wanting to see them flourish. You're wanting to see them hit their potential. You're wanting to see them become the best version of themselves. But as a leader, we can't really do that, at least in my experiences, Scott, unless we are authentic ourselves and we actually own all the little idiosyncrasies that we have that maybe they do rub someone wrong, and we want to be mindful of that, but we don't want to change our nature, because then we start to perform. And I ran into that in my own journey. I remember it was so important for me to, say the right things and do the right things and hit the mark, just as a professional speaker and communicator, that there were pockets of time in the trajectory of my career where I disconnected from my authenticity.
Yeah.
And I noticed it in the seminar. And that's really what made me realize that the real value and importance of having, managing your particles, but having that awareness, that self-awareness for frequency.
Chris, let's go deeper into this, because one of Franklin Covey's aphorisms, if you will, is intent counts more than technique. And in one of our sales performance solutions, we talk a lot about really understanding what is your intent when it comes to sales or client work. And I don't know if I fully believe that intent counts more than technique, meaning I can have the best intent in the world, and my technique, meaning my energy, my frequency, my presence, my vocabulary, the way I communicate, it can bury my intent if I don't have a little more congruency and alignment with my intent and my technique. I have, I think, very strong intent, and I have sometimes overwhelming technique. That's both been an asset and a liability to my relationships, my friendships, my marriage, the culture of my team. I actually think it is such a precarious challenge, is it not, to understand how you are received without disingenuously tapping that down or changing that, because it will become obvious that you're trying to do something different or speak differently. To me, I've just found that to be kind of a lifelong quandary, because if I am who I am, that's not received very well sometimes. And I have a lot of friends that are shy and quiet, retiring and conflict avoidant, and they rarely have any problems. They rarely get much done, quite frankly. But that's an overstep, I know. What advice would you give me? You're not a therapist, but what advice would you give the millions of people like me whose intent is pure, but their technique may be often getting in the way of that being expressed and accepted?
I think it boils down to understanding, the realities of life. It's one of the things I mentioned. I had a passion for really understanding what makes life life. And polarity is part of it. And, opposites are part of it. So I do believe we're always going to be in that dance of the opposites being very important, two sides of every single coin. One thing that's very helpful that I have found is recognizing that human beings, I believe, are here to measure energy and manipulate energy, and not manipulate in the way that there's negative connotations to manipulate, but manipulate in inspire and influence, some of those more organic, intangible ways that we interface with reality. When you have a person that has dual personality, they have really great technique, but their intention is one thing, or they're, as you beautifully displayed, I think it's important to have a balance. I don't think that you should have really great intention, but then not work on your technique. I think I wouldn't want to get into an airplane where the technique wasn't really great, or we weren't measuring the energy. I think the marriage between the two is a very important component, and harmony is important. A lot of folks get confused with balance. Once we have balance, we lose movement. But if we have harmony, then it sort of sways a little bit with our team members. We can bring our authenticity to the table, but we can also recognize that technique is very important.
I like that phrase. That's a good reminder for me, is to make sure that my intent and my technique are in harmony so that my frequency is well received. You write a lot about engagement in your book. Franklin Covey has a point of view on this, and that is that leaders don't create engagement. You can't force someone to be engaged. You probably can force someone to be disengaged, but leaders don't create engagement. What they do is they create the conditions for members of your team to choose their own level of engagement, high or low. Talk a little bit about the connection between a leader understanding his or her frequency and the conditions that they are creating for potentially high or low employee engagement.
Anytime you have an organization or a team, you think about what you would want as a leader or as an employee. If you create the conditions that allow a certain level of autonomy or freedom, you recognize that every employee is different. You're going to have some employees that really do like to stay focused and they're not very social. You're going to have employees that really need that extra, hand-holding, for lack of a better phrase, to move through a process. If you're sensitive enough and you can attune into your team and recognize that everyone is different, it doesn't mean we change all policies because one person is leaning this way or another person is leaning that way. But we try to find that common denominator as a team and then create that environment. I really do believe that engagement is a byproduct of a great environment and a great frequency. I'll give you an example. I remember when I started a new role in an organization, I was brand new, and my supervisor said, "Okay, Kristen, you're gonna hit the ground running." And I thought, "Okay, I'm ready. I can hit the ground running. I'm from New Jersey," and it was this thing. But when I went in, another employee came up to me and said, "Okay, it's the Thanksgiving holiday. Make sure you have your gloves ready." And I stopped and I thought, my gloves ready? What do my gloves have to do with with Thanksgiving? And so then another kind individual came up to me and communicated, "Well, we're giving out free frozen turkeys out of the Human Resources Department, and you need to be ready to give out those free turkeys." And it was at that moment that I paused and just stopped. I'm giving out free turkeys to 2,400 employees. And it was just, my heart exploded. To see leadership care so much about the employees and to create such fun around the holiday to make sure everyone was gifted a frozen turkey, it created this warmth and this beauty between individuals. And sure enough, I put my gloves on and I spent the next 4 or 5 hours with every single employee coming up to the Human Resources Department and handing them a frozen turkey. That is an example of a compassionate leader, a leader that understands that if somebody, doesn't have Thanksgiving meal, then, it's really challenging to come to work every day. So that's not the answer to all organizations, and it's certainly not, the quick fix, but there are certain things you can do as a leader to recognize the diversity that our organizations are made of and then create that environment integrating all of the different components. And we like to use Frequency Matters as a unifying language to help folks do that, so we avoid getting in the weeds of some of those things that can happen.
I was convinced you were going to say, get your gloves on like boxing gloves because it's Thanksgiving and there's going to be vitriol around the family table, which is every table, unfortunately, it seems like, in America now. Let's pivot to a conversation you write in the book about you call the 4 key practices for frequency alignment. Before we go there, let me remind all of our listeners and viewers that you probably are not as self-aware as you think you are about your frequency, your energy, your mojo, your vibe, your instincts, and your feelings. And what a great time to go sit down with your colleagues and say, hey, I'm really trying to work on my frequency, meaning how I'm received, what it's like to be in a meeting with me, what it's like to have me lead a project, what it's like to be in a one-on-one with me. And I want to create a culture, or the conditions in a culture, where you love coming to work, where you love working with me and working for me, perhaps. What are some things I could do to marshal or channel or even hold back my energy that may not be working well for you? First, you have to be aware of your frequency. Now let's talk about the 4 key practices for frequency alignment. Hello. Number 1, find and align your frequency. Kristen, riff on that.
All right, find and align your frequency is know what your ingredients are. Take the tests, do the inventory work, really get self-reflective. What do I love? What are my strengths? What are the things that are triggers for me? What are unconscious programming or things that I was, imprint vulnerability when I was a child? Know your recipe. When you have a clear idea of yourself and all of the different details that make up you, you'll be able to alter your energy in a way that is aligned with what your intention is. And then you invest in the skill set and the techniques, as you mentioned, Scott, that really create a harmony within.
I got to stop there because I think it's so valuable to talk about the habits and the personality traits that are so programmed into us, whether they were programmed from our genetics or our upbringing, or we just consciously modeled them from some early leader or teacher we thought was successful or impressive, or those were maybe behaviors that were valued in a circumstance academically or professionally. We just adopted them subconsciously. There's a gentleman I used to work with who I'm a big fan of, transition figure in my life, and he does something that is unsettling, is he constantly checks his watch. And it has increased as he has moved from kind of a normal watch that buzzes now to like one of those, sort of whole body watches that monitors your everything, right? Your calories and your intake, your steps. And I'll be in a meeting with this person and, 4 or 5 times during the meeting, he'll look at his watch. And I'm always thinking, oh, I must be boring, which is really the case with me. Or I must be taking too long on a point, which is always the case for me. Or I need to move it along. I'm over my time. I'm not self-aware. And I'll say, is our time up? And I'll say, no, sorry. He's just like responding to text from his spouse or his kids, whatever it was. And he's completely unaware of the frequency that he is setting off. I, believe it or not, always feel a little bit anxious and unsettled meeting with him because I think I'm either not being clear, dragging my point on, overextending my time, and in fact has nothing to do with me. It's his frequency, which is rare. Usually I'm the one that's screwing it up. But in this case, I'm on track. It's him. I think the more we can be aware of these ingrained traits and habits, the better we can dial our frequency to the right direction.
Yes. I love that. And I think it's human nature, Scott. I think it's human nature for us to observe a certain behavior. And there's a lot of really comical movies about it where, somebody scratches their ear and it means this, or they have a little, body adapter where they're swinging their pen. And we can sometimes internalize that. And then we internalize it and it hits all of maybe even the messaging we had as a child or our growing up or what we were exposed to. And it triggers triggers us in that way, when in reality that the person might just have had an itch on their face. So I think it's human nature. I think if we are compassionate and empathic to the journey of what it means to be a human being, we can give ourselves a little leeway in the space of not being so perfect, and then also give that to the people that we're interfacing with, and that creates a good energy.
That was actually beautifully said. Maybe have a little more passion and compassion for the reason people behave the way they do, and maybe give them a little latitude on their own frequency. 4 key practices for frequency alignment. Number 1 was find and align your frequency, which was probably like 90% of the work. Number 2 is think with your head, know with your body. And you actually put know in bold and italics in the book. Expand on number 2, think with your head, know with your body.
Yes, part of knowing yourself, back to the example of the recipe, is to know the different feelings you get in a certain situation. I think the black and white scenarios where you see something a little bit dangerous and you know, oh, I don't want to go in that direction. But I encourage individuals to go even deeper to when you feel something that just feels right. It just feels good. And personally, I've had that experience where I feel a sort of ding in the center of my body. An example, my first book that I wrote has cartoons, and there are 52 cartoons. And they're really not sophisticated cartoons. They're actually stick figures. But I wanted each of the faces to have a certain expression because they were giving an energy by the facial expressions. And I drew each one of those cartoons 7, 8, 9 times until I looked at that cartoon and said, boom, that's the cartoon. That's the one that I feel is the right cartoon. And to me personally, that has been the journey of excellence. If I'm studying something or I'm working on something, I will do it over and over until I feel in my body is telling me that is the direction you want to go. That is, that hits the bullseye. A lot of times, we're all guilty of it, make a shortcut or, find a fast way to do something. I found that when I listen to my body, it will not allow me to do those things. So I usually, at least to the best of my ability, try to achieve excellence with knowing with your body and finding a language inside your body. But I won't go too deep on that, but finding a language inside your body that tells you when something is on or off for you, aligned, not aligned. It works for you, it doesn't work for you. And when you trust yourself, you're going to have resonance. And when you trust yourself, your team is going to trust you. And the people around you are going to trust you because you're congruent. You're a congruent human being. Maybe flawed, but you're congruent.
You write in the book, isn't it time we master the skills to effectively collaborate with fundamentally different people who also display this heightened sense of personal congruency to make collaboration and meaningful contributions and, of course, create a highly engaged environment. Your third practice for frequency alignment, Kristen, is trust resonance, manage dissonance. Expand on that.
When you trust resonance, it is the byproduct of the steps that I just shared, where you do the inner work and you are self-reflective and you understand the nature of yourself and all the ingredients that make you you. You also are compassionate and understanding and mindful and empathic to all the ingredients that make up someone else. And when you have those two pieces together, you find it becomes very easy to trust resonance. You run into it when dissonance comes in. If you're not congruent, you can be easily influenced. You can be easily influenced in the wrong direction. It may not be a great business decision or a good direction for you or your team to go. So I often recommend individuals work on themselves first, really get congruent within, be mindful and very tolerant of the diversity and differences of other individuals. But when you are congruent, you will be able to identify if something is not in alignment with your core values. I think intellectually understanding something is one level, but when we understand it at an emotional level and a behavioral level, an epigenetic level, as you pointed out earlier, Scott, it becomes a different level of understanding energy and how we really do impact each other.
Your fourth practice you call wait for the ding. And I read it because I understand it intellectually, but I don't know if I've actually ever experienced it sort of practically. Riff on that.
Yes, wait for the ding is, really being in a situation where you do something again and you want to achieve excellence. You just know. Have you ever had a situation, Scott, where you were working on something, very diligently and you were throwing some ideas around and then all of a sudden your whole body lit up. You're like, yeah, this is great. I love this. I'm feeling this. This feels awesome. It's boom. And that is what I equated as the ding. I experienced it as a professional speaker when I would get out of the way of what I was speaking and really attune into my audience, and I would hear or sense what they needed. And as a result, I would communicate in a way that they could hear me. And that became a lot of fun because instead of sort of hinging to the outline or hinging to a certain set of criterion that I needed to do, I was able to tap into what they might have needed. So the ding is something that our bodies tell us we're on or off track. It's no different than a gut instinct, but I think it's a little bit deeper than the classic gut instinct. To me, I apply it to technique and I will keep working on something until I feel the ding. And then when I feel that ding, I know I'm on track with providing excellence.
Okay, you asked me if I'd ever felt that about 7 times a day, which now that I listen to you, I realize that I can do anything, but I can't do everything. So maybe part of my frequency issue, Kristen, is that my dinger is just going off nonstop, which is a little bit narcissistic, a little bit validating, and a whole hell of a lot distracting. Hey, let's close our conversation. You write, I think, rather profoundly in the book, Frequency Matters. You wrote, find and align your frequency because you cannot fake presence. And this is really important because I have met a lot of people, good people, smart people, hardworking leaders, entrepreneurs, intrapreneurs, that they read a book or they go to a course or they get a coach and they come back on the Monday morning phone call and you can just tell that they're desperate to try to implement a new question or make better connection with their team, and they seem on fire and they kind of know they're doing the right thing, but it's super awkward because it's not their natural personality. And then it starts to sustain the next week, and it dissipates the third week, and the fourth week they're back to their own selves because it's not natural. They just can't fake that. Doesn't mean they're bad people. Doesn't mean they can't develop relationships. It's just not naturally who they are. Talk about the risk of faking presence, and maybe how do you bring presence naturally when it's not natural?
Yes, the risk of faking presence is that people can tell. People can tell. We can see someone that may be rough around the edges, but we can sense, or at least I like to think most of us as human beings can sense good intentions, someone doing what they need to do. But when you're incongruent, what you're thinking, what you're feeling, and what you're behaving is out of alignment with your core values, you're going to get dissonance within. And then you run the risk of emulating someone else or letting influence you, and you get away from your nature. And I think the more we are at home with ourselves, I call it your home signature frequency. I think a lot of people might be afraid of their home signature frequency because there's a learning curve to the home signature frequency. We are not perfect right out of the bat being ourselves. We're going to fumble the ball. We're going to practice. It's the wonderful work you do, Scott, with careers and mentorship. We all have been down that road where we are learning. And imagine individuals learning, in some cases, for the very first time, how to naturally be themselves. And they're not going to be perfect. And so I think self-compassion is really important. Compassion for each other, holding high standards, I think is also part of that as a great leader, really holding those standards and offering the tools and the resources to help somebody achieve what they know that they can achieve. But it's not common that folks, at least in my experience, and maybe you had a different experience, but if somebody is not comfortable being themselves, you're going to feel that. And leaders that bring that energy to a space, I personally have found in my experience, it makes them feel a little uneasy because you splinter trust that way.
Here's what I think. I'm going to end on this. I don't think most of us know who we are.
Right.
I don't think most of us have ever been invited or taught or encouraged or coached to really understand who we are. What do we really value? Yep. What is our personality and why is it that way, and when and where and how is it working for or against us or others? What are we really passionate about? What brings us joy and fulfillment and meaning? I don't think, and I meet a lot of people. I represent, hundreds of people as an agent. I interview hundreds of people, keynote a lot like you, probably 50 times a year. And I don't think the vast majority of people have ever given themselves permission or have an architecture or a framework or a structure, or like you love workbooks that have had a guided path to sit down and say, this is who I am, this is who I want to become, this is what I should maybe stop doing, this is what I should do more of. I think a lot of us live in fear. I think all of us live in fear. Fear of fitting in, fear of being valued, fear of being fired, fear of, if you will, not being promoted. We mold ourselves into the culture that we think the company needs us to be, so we're masquerading as someone that we're not. So today, Kristen is kind of giving everyone listening and watching permission to go do the work. I don't think you have to have a workbook. I don't think you have to have a psychiatrist or go to a $15,000 mastermind. Sit down and journal. Talk about who you are and what you want to be and what you value. What is your frequency? How high is it vibrating? How low is it vibrating? It's actually really interesting. As I read your book, I had this metaphor of that metronome. I never played piano or any music, but that little sort of triangular box on a piano. And mine would have been, had you taken that bar and put it all the way at the bottom, I think, and it would have gone tick, 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 versus like, my wife, Stephanie, all the way to the top, and it kind of to the left and to the right, which is why everybody likes her so much. But I also loved this piece in the book you wrote about why adult coloring books are so popular. It's so funny. I'll go to Barnes & Noble multiple times a week because it's kind of my happy place. Right. My wife says it's irresponsible because of the credit card. But I see these like adult coloring books and I think, who has time for that? Who, how, why, what? And kind of after reading your book, I thought, maybe I would be more effective if my frequency were a little more in balance and congruent. And maybe I should be one of those who's buying an adult coloring book. Kristen, I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, your book, and your work. Today we talked about one of your books, Frequency Matters. Be a contributor, not an employee. Thank you today for joining us and inspiring us as we go into the holidays, thinking a little more about how valuable those adult coloring books might be as we better calibrate our frequency. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor, Scott. Thank you.
And we'll see you back here next week for a new conversation on leadership.